Okay, welcome everyone to the CCOD panel. My name is James Rice. I'm a policy fellow at the Council for Countering Online Disinformation, CCOD, and a PhD candidate in political economy at the University of Essex, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. My own work looks at AI, the financial and economic weaponization of the information environment, and engineered political campaigns targeting climate action. For anyone joining us for the first time, the Council for Countering Online Disinformation is a London-based policy-facing organization. We bring together people from academia, policy, industry, and civil society to understand how online disinformation changes public life, and we try to turn that understanding into practical, political, and proportionate responses to the threats from disinformation. Today's panel reflects that mix. We have a scholar of European counter-disinformation policy, a communications specialist whose research examines political deepfakes, and a policy analyst working on AI, privacy, and democratic accountability. We argue in this session that democracy's information problem is never only a technology problem, but also a political and social one. Two quick housekeeping notes. We're recording the session, and after the session, an edited version will be shared on CCOD's media channels. And throughout the session, if you happen to have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You don't need to wait for us to invite questions. At the end of the session, after the moderated Q&A, I will begin posing the audience's questions to our panelists. So please, if you have any comments throughout, put them in the Q&A function, and I promise we will get to them. So I'll try to bring in as many of your questions as time allows at the end. This is the third CCOD summer webinar we've hosted in the past couple of months. This is a set of conversations taking different parts of the disinformation problem and looking at them from different perspectives. In our first webinar, we looked at how AI-enabled false narratives translate into real-world harm. Following that, our CEO, Thomas Barton, and a research fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, Sam Stockwell, discussed the future of disinformation regulation after the closure of DCIT. Today, we're asking what happens to democracy itself when political speech can be generated algorithmically at scale. Evidence, including digital evidence, can be manufactured, dismissed, and fabricated, and decisions about truth, visibility, and identity are increasingly made through algorithmic systems that the public cannot observe. So to introduce the session, why did we decide on today's theme for the session? The CCOD strongly believes, like many other actors, that disinformation is a huge risk to democracy. We've seen this increasingly clearly in recent years. The UK's Foreign Affairs Committee, for example, has warned that the UK and other liberal democracies are the main targets for malicious actors when it comes to hostile disinformation and influence campaigns engineered by foreign states and rogue groups. The committee has stated that if we don't address the threat from disinformation, it has the potential to seriously undermine our democracy. Democracy depends on people being able to form their own opinions, have access to reliable information, and participate in public debate without being manipulated behind the scenes. Disinformation undermines this and chips away at our institutions, the public trust in the media, and ultimately the trust in the democratic process itself. At the same time, AI can make manipulation cheaper, faster, and more targeted. So we want to unpack these things today. We want to look at who has the power over the information we see, how messages become shared common knowledge, and how the AI systems used to defend or administer public life can themselves redistribute democratic power. Democracy requires institutions people regard as legitimate, spaces in which disagreement is possible, evidence that can still settle at least some disputes, and a public that believes political power can be questioned and changed. AI makes persuasion cheaper and more personalized, and it can reproduce the language and identity of a community at extraordinary speed, weakening our shared sense of authenticity. Today, we follow three connected questions. One, how democratic institutions govern the information space, how messages become shared common knowledge, and how AI systems can be used to defend or administer public life. So let me introduce our three speakers briefly, and then I'll invite each of them to open in turn with a brief introductory remarks. So first we have Dr. Sophie L. Veriter, who's research fellow at Leiden University's Institute of Security and Global Affairs. Her work traces how European misinformation and counter-misinformation policy has evolved, including the securitization of disinformation, strategic communication, hybrid threats, and the institutional politics of information governance. Her research asks questions central to today's discussion, whether the way democracies organize their response can build public trust or weaken it. Second, we have Eliza Solomon, who's currently a social media content strategist and thought leadership builder at Ezra. She holds an MSc in social and political communication, or social and public communication from the London School of Economics, where her research examined people's discernment and emotional responses to deepfake political speeches featuring US presidential candidates, research I had firsthand exposure to while I was a master's student with her. Her professional and academic work meet around a fundamental principle of our digital world, that audience should come before content. People interpret messages through identity, community, and the shared language they already use. Finally, we have Giovanna de Custodia, who's a CCOD policy fellow and a researcher and policy analyst specializing in the governance of emerging technologies, particularly AI ethics, surveillance, privacy, and accountability in public institutions. She currently works at Chambers and Partners, and her prize-winning LSE dissertation examined the private AI-powered surveillance technologies behind U.S. immigration control and how public-private systems create a double black box for democratic oversight. She's contributed work with UNESCO, the Mozilla Foundation, and the European Parliament at the intersection of digital governance, democracy, and human rights. So now I'll ask each of you for an opening statement of around 8 to 10 minutes. So if you could perhaps fill in details about your personal journey, your professional journey, set out the problem of AI and democracy as you see it, and tell us what you think the AI and democracy debate is going and what it perhaps misses. So Sophie, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Eliza and Giovanna in that order. So Sophie, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, and the CCOD for having me today. It's a pleasure to be on this panel alongside my fellow panelists, which I'm very excited to hear as well, their take on this. But I have the honor of kicking off this conversation. So let me get started. I'll start with briefly introducing myself, my background, and then I'll talk about my work and my research and my thoughts and what I have written on this topic. So I'm a research fellow at Leiden University, like you said, where I defended my PhD on the origins, evolution, and prospects of the EU's counter-misinformation policy. I'm also the founding director of the Global Society Foundation, which is a non-profit based in the Netherlands that aims to conduct research and develop technology for democratic resilience. And so my work really sits in between those two worlds now, the research of understanding how to define, how to conceptualize this, and how to operationalize it, and then something that's a little bit more impact driven in social entrepreneurship. My background before this, so I did my MPhil in politics at the University of Oxford, and I also led an interdisciplinary research lab that was focusing on deliberative and participatory democracy called Level Up across 8 different universities, during which we came up with this idea of gamifying democracy and making democracy more fun. And this was before the advent of ChatGPT, so I think we would have even more fun today toying with this question. And even before that, I worked as a consultant in strategic communication. And so I built the network called the Young European Ambassadors, which is the largest EU network as part of its public diplomacy campaign. And it now has over 2,500 members, but it started from a very humble beginning, trying to understand how we could reach young people in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union and connect young people across something that was more community driven. And in that capacity, that's actually how I started working with the EAS and its East Stratcom Task Force, which, if you are at all interested in European Union and policy against disinformation, I'm sure you've heard of it. So at the very beginning of this task force, we were working together, obviously being active in the Eastern neighborhood. And that's really that experience that has shaped my research interest, because, of course, I was always very interested in the European Union's relationship with this Eastern neighborhood, having written my bachelor thesis on the European Union's response to the crisis in Ukraine that was happening in 2014. But it was really my first experience working there and becoming aware of the very insidious ways that propaganda finds its ways into society that really shaped my research interest. And working with the East Stratcom Task Force and realizing how important their work was, I really wondered, like, why didn't we do this sooner? Like, why didn't we do more about this as a European continent? And so that really shaped the direction of my research, which is really trying to understand the political behind the scenes of the EU's responses to misinformation and disinformation. So rather than looking at the issue and unpacking how bad really misinformation is, I was looking at the responses and trying to understand who influenced that response, how, in which space, with which strategies, and with what interests. Because I think that that's really important to understand then the quality of the response and whether it actually targets the issues that are created by misinformation. So this is the research I did during my MPhil at Oxford and my PhD at Leiden, which in summary can be understood along three streams. First, understanding the origins of where did this even start? Because if you look back 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a policy response or a team working on misinformation at the European Union level. And actually, when you look at how things have developed, the European Union has actually predated most of the national responses when it comes to countering misinformation, which is very unusual. Usually, responses start at the national level and then they get, uploaded to the European Union level. But in this case, it was actually opposite. So looking at the origins of that, I thought was extremely fascinating. So understanding something that originated at the EU level and also originated in an area that was really unlikely, which is the common foreign and security policy. With this East Stratcom task force being, lodged inside the European External Action Service, I thought was fascinating. And so the first leg of my work was trying to unpack, how did this happen? Who did this? It was a little bit of a detective work, trying to, understand who was involved in this. And I'm sure anybody who has done research will empathize with this and find this experience familiar. I thought originally that it would, that my research, my findings would show this very strategic upstream direction of, oh, it must have been the high representative that realized this was something really important. And then there was like this whole strategy behind it. And of course, all my hypotheses were proven wrong during the research process. And what I found actually was that a couple of very small states have driven that whole thing forward and were really the force behind the origins of the EU's response to misinformation and disinformation. And in majority, this state was Latvia, a very small country, which you might not even realize has a lot of influence, because there's a lot of theory in EU policymaking that only the big states really matter. And then here I was realizing that actually a very small state like Latvia was behind all this. And so what my research shows is how Latvia was really a coalition driver and a coalition builder, really lobbying for a response against disinformation at the EU level and really driving this forward. Then I looked at how that whole policy has evolved through time since the first time when it originated in 2015 with the creation of the East Stratton Task Force to what we have today, which is a very comprehensive toolkit that's not just in the common foreign and security policy area and in the EEAS, but now also has found its place within the European Commission as well. So we have seen this very massive expansion of the toolkit against disinformation at the EU level. And so looking at this evolution, I try to replicate this same detective work of understanding how exactly did this new policies and regulations take place? Who influenced it? Why and how? And one particular development that I thought was worth really digging into was the recent ban on Russian state-sponsored media, RT, formerly known as Russia Today, and Sputnik. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2002, immediately after, like 4 days later, the European Union sanctioned these two media and completely banned them from broadcasting in Europe. So that's why today, if you try to go on the website of Sputnik or RT, you could not. Their social media accounts were not accessible anymore, and they were not all on TV channels, for example, in hotel rooms. I thought that was very popular before. So that wasn't the case anymore. And I thought, wow, that's really unusual. Like, how did that happen? Because it's quite an unprecedented move for the European Union to completely ban a media outlet. So looking at that, I actually realized how this whole issue of disinformation had been securitized. So what securitization means is framing something that is more of a political problem into a security problem. And what that does is, well, when you frame something as an existential threat, it opens up a whole new range of ways of making decisions in a fast and more efficient way with less democratic checks and balances, with less democratic oversight. And that's exactly what happened with this ban. It was adopted in record time and in closed door channels called the confessionals, which I thought I was like, oh my God, this sounds like a Netflix series, rather than an ordinary procedure that would really involve some kind of debate. And basically, this is what I thought leads to a little bit of a problem because there is not much legitimacy behind these responses. And for something as important as freedom of expression and freedom of the media, I thought, I think that's a little bit of a problem. But I'm happy to expand on that later. Um, what I basically think when it comes to disinformation policy in Europe is that it was built really fast by a coalition of very motivated and very interested actors, most of the time through informal channels and through this security logic of securitization, and very often bypassing the scrutiny that would make those measures really democratically legitimate. So that's the problem I see. It's not so much with the responses and the measure themselves, although there are also lots of questions on whether they're actually effective, but more on how can we build legitimacy in the design of these measures. And that's really what I think is fundamental for those measures to be effective as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was incredibly in-depth and incredibly wide-ranging discussion of EU and international policy on dis and misinformation, which I'm sure we would love to unpack in the Q&A. So stay tuned. I'd like to turn it over now to Eliza, our second panelist, who will give her overview and introduction of her views on mis and disinformation and democracy.
Well, first off, I just want to say thank you so much, James, for having me, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Sophie, that was incredible, and I'm very excited to pick your brain about it more after this webinar. Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Eliza. Nice to meet you all. I am a content strategist and currently oversee content at Ezra, a coaching company, and started my career at TED. I was really interested in messaging and in how ideas are spread. And I did my master's in social and public communication at LC with a focus in political communication. And so my master's research really started with one question: how do you decide whether something you're watching is real? And I explored political deepfakes in a very contentious time, the height of the 2024 US political election. During my master's research, the candidate switched from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, but I looked at political deep fakes of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so 2 years ago, I would have told you that the answer to that question I asked, how do you decide whether something you're watching is real, lives in the image itself. Artifacts, blink rate, the slightly wrong shadow. But my master's research really suggested and tested that assumption directly, where I used real and AI generated political speeches of the 2024 US candidates, and it showed that it did not hold up. So I ran a mixed methods study, a survey of 261 people with 3 focus groups with 13 people. James was one of those focus groups participants. And everyone watched a mix of real campaign footage, AI generated deepfakes built from ChatGPT scripts, wrapped in cloned voices, and a stranger category, which were historical deepfakes, where we had Biden delivering Obama's Yes We Can 2008 speech and Trump reciting the Gettysburg Address. And then we measured what people believed and how much they trusted it and how it made them feel, looking at trust, empathy, and inspiration, key tenets of political communication. And so here is a little clip of, I'll just play the first few seconds.
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived and lived.
So as you can tell, there are some structural inconsistencies. That's the point. So what really is, so headline finding here is whichever version people saw, real, AI generated, or historical, made almost no statistical difference to how authentic they judged the material or to how much trust, empathy, or inspiration it produced, but rather what made the difference, in a very large one, was which candidate they already supported. So political affiliation explained close to a quarter of the variance in perceived authenticity for Biden and over 40% for Trump. So someone who found one's candidate video authentic tended to find the others fake, regardless of which video actually was real. And so there's a mechanism sort of beneath that. Whether someone actually spotted the deep fake barely changed how directly, how authentic they rated it. It worked almost indirectly through their sense of whether they successfully detected the deception. In our focus group, a similar pattern showed up as something closer to a habit of mind. I would say that it was almost as if participants rationalized the inconsistencies in the fabricated footage, leaning on cultural cues, a candidate's crowd reaction, a familiar phrase, as proof of realness. And when the content faltered, they chose not to, they chose to find the cues that confirmed their existing viewpoints and let the rest go unquestioned. So when it came to spotting deception, they were skewed by this. And so what we saw, especially within the focus groups, was this rationalization of fabrication, emotional dominance, and a lot of cultural anchoring. Common phrases like "God bless America" were used to justify that the video was real. And we also explored confirmation bias within this existing framework. So, telling people it's fake doesn't also fix it either. So I've been glued into the space of deepfake research, and what I found is that distinction has only got the distinction of the problem of deepfakes has only gone more urgent since I finished my work. And in January of this year, Simon Clark and Stephen Ledwanski at the University of Bristol published a study in the communication psychology, asking the most direct policy relevant question one can ask: does telling someone up front that the video is fake protect them from its influence? And across 3 experiments, they found that the answer was largely no. People watched a deepfake confession video and kept relying on what they'd seen even after an explicit warning, even when they said afterwards that they believed the warning up front. So again, this suggests that detection and belief can turn out to be separable. And I think when we think about broader implications as a society, we're not seeing we don't need hypotheticals to see this play out in real time. In February of this year, President Trump released on his own Truth Social account a AI-generated video that in its final seconds placed the faces of Barack and Michelle Obama on cartoon monkeys, embedded inside a minute-long clip pushing 2020 election conspiracy claims. It stayed live roughly 12 hours before removal and after a lot of bipartisan backlash. The White House initially called it a meme referencing The Lion King and then dropped it without future explanation. The president later said he wouldn't apologize, and as we've heard, but 2 months after that, the same account posted and then deleted an AI image showing the president in a healing pose that read to most viewers as Christ-like, days after he had publicly criticized Pope Leo IV. He said after it depicted him as a doctor. I'm not raising these because they are deep fakes in the sense of the term, but they're closer to memes or trolling. Depending on who you ask, they could be seen as deliberate signaling. But that is exactly the point my data would predict. The label doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it is. Millions of people saw synthetic content, some of it openly degrading, from the most powerful office in the world, and the reaction split almost entirely along the same partisan lines that drove authenticity judgments in my study 2 years earlier. So what does this tell us? This is what a post-truth information environment actually looks like day to day. It's not one dramatic deception that fools everyone, but rather a permanent low-grade condition where an image, a video, or a clip could be real or synthetic. The viewer has stopped expecting to tell the difference from content alone. So I would say the rational response shouldn't be cynicism. In fact, we should treat authenticity as an automatic question when it comes to any political messaging or speech or video or image that we see. Um, and this, and I see, as Sophie spoke to about policy, as much as an individual can take on the habit of questioning the content they consume, it's not a substitute for policy. And voluntarily labeling helps, but as we saw from Clark and Ludwanski's data, it suggests that it's not sufficient on its own. Alongside media literacy, we need enforceable disclosure requirements for synthetic political content. We need platform accountability for how fast manipulated media involving public figures gets removed or gets seen or gets processed on these applications. And we need regulatory clarity that doesn't leave platforms or people targeted by this content to police it themselves. So the governments I believe, need to find a way forward to regulate this kind of content. But for the meantime, we can all really proceed at looking at political messaging and political content with a very dubious eye. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Eliza. Super interesting and a great sort of almost micro level look at the psychology of how individuals discern and uptake different types of information, including mis and disinformation. So it certainly will be valuable in the discussion to come. So I'd like to turn now to Giovanna, our last panelist. Giovanna, if you'd like to introduce yourself and maybe give us an introduction of your views on the topic of today's webinar.
Well, thank you so much, James, for having me on and for organizing the webinar. And yeah, thank you, Eliza and Sophie. Very, very interesting points, and I'm really excited for the discussion that is to come after this. So just sort of, as a brief introduction to myself and then my background in this space. My name is Giovanna. I am a regulatory and policy professional. I've worked on a number of research projects across online safety and digital governance throughout my academic and professional career. Currently, I work as a research analyst at Chambers and Partners. We are a international legal directory as well as a legal think tank, and I focus my work on the TMT sector in the EMEA jurisdictions, so the Europe, Middle East, and Africa jurisdictions, and I do regulatory research there. But I'm also, as James has said, a policy fellow at the CCOD. And while I'm sort of dabbling in a number of projects, I'm currently focusing my sort of CCOG project thesis, if you will, on the privacy and data protection implications of using age verification technology in the proposed or sort of in the works under 16 social media ban the UK government has recently announced. Just a little bit on sort of my academic background and my professional background as well before these positions. So I am also an LSE alumni, I think, like James and Eliza. I did my MSc in public policy at the European Institute at LSE. And prior to that, I did my bachelor's at Sciences Po in Paris. I have also worked as a research assistant for 3, 4 years at the Sciences Po Law School. And whilst I was there, I had the opportunity to help on a number of projects commissioned by the Matilda Foundation, the European Parliament, UNESCO on sort of platform accountability, AI liability, digital governance, and so this is how I came in to be sort of introduced to this topic, and from there I sort of chose to focus my master's thesis on the governance of emerging technologies. And so, sort of talking about my master's thesis, which is sort of the basis of what I hope to bring to our discussion today, is sort of I think a little bit distinct and to an extent I would say maybe a little bit more tangential to this information, but definitely linked to AI and democracy, which is effectively looking at the increasingly prevalent use, increasingly prevalent use of inscrutable tech, notably AI-powered tech, by the state, by democratic states, in the in their public functions. So, for example, for my MSc dissertation, as I think James pointed out earlier, I focused on the use of privately procured surveillance technology by the Department of Homeland Security and notably by ICE in the US in their immigration control functions. And the key thing I think to discuss about sort of the use of these technologies is the fact that liberal democratic governance is, generally speaking, rests on a baseline of contestability. So citizens' ability to know why a decision affecting them was made and to challenge it. But when the state adopts AI or other inscrutable technologies, algorithmic-based technologies, to carry out core public functions like policing, like immigration control, but increasingly less securitized policy issues like healthcare or social security dissemination, I think this baseline is inherently undermined because AI decision making is particularly LLMs is sort of notoriously inscrutable and not transparent and what we would call a black box. So that's something I sort of hope to bring into the discussion today is looking, okay, how can we design, it's inevitable that AI will be used in our public systems to carry out governance functions. And then in a way, it's a positive development. It could lead to greater efficiency. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're using AI and other emerging technologies in a way that is compliant with our liberal democratic values, which means accountability, contestability, and protection of fundamental rights. So I think that's something that I would hope that we could come to discuss sort of later on in our Q&A sort of section. And then sort of another sort of research that I would like to bring into the discussion is looking at, as I said, verification technology, not just age verification technology, but sort of broad verification technology, both personhood and identity verification technology. So this would be, for example, age verification technology, but just ID, I sort of ID verification. So is this a human or is this a bot, for example, that kind of stuff. But also content provenance verification technology. So this would be, for example, watermarking. And in the context of this conversation is technology that would help us to answer the question of, is this content produced by an AI or is this content produced by a human being? And I think it's sort of important to discuss this as well, because most of the systems that are actually shaping democratic life online, so content moderation, verification technology, and so on, are obviously not built by the state. They are regulated by the state, but they are privately developed systems deployed privately. And I think particularly with verification technology, they're deployed under the guise of safeguarding trust and verity, which is obviously very, very important in a media ecosystem that, as Eliza has touched on, for example, is increasingly mediated by distorted information. So it does serve a public interest function, but at the same time, on the other hand, the technology that tends to be the most effective at verifying whether it's human or AI generated also tends to be the one that's most, or whether users over 18 or over 16 also tends to be the most invasive and could lead to function creep and to surveillance. So again, similarly to the use by states of AI or other emerging technologies, for governance, we need to find a way here as well as how can we regulate this privately deployed technology in a way that balances between the need to verify what is AI generated and what is human generated within our media and information ecosystem, but also the need to safeguard user privacy and data protection, and to stop these tools from becoming tools of surveillance, which could be misused or mismanaged by certain harmful actors. So I think those are the two streams that I would like to sort of try and bring into our discussion today.
Great. Thanks so much for that brief overview, Giovanna. And thank you all for your discussions. That gives us essentially three different routes into the same question, which I was sort of hoping to get at in this panel. So let me connect a few of those threads. And just as a reminder to everyone, you can continue to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them in about 20 minutes or so. So let me jump to Eliza first. This is going to be part of the moderated Q&A. I'll pose a couple of questions to each of our speakers. So Eliza, so really your work focuses on these like psychological and emotional responses and impacts to both deepfakes and other forms of mis and disinformation. And like, it's interesting because in terms of the emotional response to mis and disinformation, a viewer may suspect that a clip or an audio transcript or even a piece of text that they find on Twitter is false. So they may believe that it's false, but the information still affects them somehow emotionally. And so they could become more angry, they could become more fearful, they could become more cynical, etc. So I wonder what the impacts of that sort of disconnect between the psychological understanding and believing in a piece of misinformation and the emotional response is. So like how do is it possible that every clip changes how every subsequent piece of political speech is interpreted after you're exposed to mis and disinformation, or is there some other network or mechanism in action here?
Yeah, great question. And Giovanna, thank you for sharing. I'd love to read your research on ICE in particular. Yeah, I think the question here is about sort of authenticity and understanding political messaging, no matter whether what my research suggests and more pressing research on deep fakes and political deepfakes in particular show is that regardless of whether it's real or fake, it's still going to have an impact. So to answer your questions about the emotional effect, what it's playing into is your existing biases, your existing feelings and trust of that political candidate. For instance, a Biden supporter and during that time would automatically falsify whatever Trump claims come out because they felt very strongly about Biden, or you could say the same for Kamala Harris. I think what we see here is that a lot of political messaging confirms existing beliefs and an existing confirmation bias that you have with regards to a political candidate or political party or a political policy, even. And so something that I also was looking to even explore in my master's, what would happen if we actually had deepfakes for good? And we saw, a deepfakes used to make a politician seem more eloquent, seem more approachable, seem more likable. What would be the impact of that? And I think what we would find is that it would play into the existing belief systems that that person holds close.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I guess it plays into the predispositions that people bring into their political and social interactions. So I want to bring in Giovanna here, and then I'll come to you in a moment, Sophie, as well. But Giovanna, what you discussed at the very end of your interjection just now about verification technology and also these new forms of like watermarking technology for deepfakes is really interesting. Um, and so I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. And my question really is, when governments or organizations use these types of proprietary AI systems, it can be difficult to scrutinize how decisions are made, because both the originator of the content can claim some form of secrecy in terms of like how they created the content. So this is what we're seeing a lot with the watermarking is like, Anthropic released a new update just earlier this week, or maybe it was late last week, that said we're going to now watermark across all of our models. So any text that's generated by AI is now going to have a statistical signature within it that shows that it was AI generated. So if governments or organizations use AI to either propel foreign influence or detect malicious foreign influence, verify users, or assess the risks posed by different sources of information, uh, what safeguards should be in place, whether that's watermarking or some other form, before these systems are allowed to affect political speech or participation?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good set of questions. So I'll try to sort of answer them all or touch upon the strands that you've talked about. I think if we're talking about verification technology, which is in and of itself a very broad spectrum, but I think it broadly falls, as you mentioned, into two subcategories. So you have person or personhood or identification technology. So that would be where a technology is able to identify whether you're a human or a bot, but also to identify certain traits about an individual. So are they over the age of 18 so that they can access certain content, for example? And then you also have content provenance verification tools, which is stuff like watermarking, which as you mentioned, Anthropic has mentioned that has announced that they will be using, but also stuff like C2PA style content credentials. Um, so just sort of like a brief, overview of the or introduction into what those are. So I think that the issue is that we have to balance two things when using these technologies. On one hand, I think, as you mentioned, they serve a clear public interest, clear public interest goals in the sense that we need to verify within our media ecosystem and in our information ecosystem whether something was produced by an AI, for example, as you mentioned with like foreign intervention, or whether yes, or like going back to what Eliza was saying, was this image or this video that has sort of gone viral that could have massive political implications. This could have been generated by AI and disseminated by like a foreign government that wants to intervene in a certain electoral campaign, right? So we have to be able so that these verification tools are important, and we have to be able to they do serve this purpose, right, of differentiating between what can we trust, what can we not trust. But I think that what interests me, and I think something that isn't spoken about enough, and that tends to go a little bit, um, yes, swept a little bit under the rug because I think it's a very sort of complex technical question from just an engineering standpoint, is the privacy and data protection concerns of using these verification tools, particularly when the data is processed and stored by third-party vendors, which I think is where the element of sort of privatization comes in as well. So the issue is that oftentimes the tools that would be more effective at verifying whether a content is AI generated or whether it's not AI generated, which would carry a lot of metadata, so a lot of information about the provenance of that content. So if it was a photograph, for example, the maybe the camera serial number, the geotag, and so on and so forth, is the one which is most threatening to privacy, particularly if that data is stored by third-party vendors, which are in another state, for example, or in another jurisdiction with less stringent data protection um, regulation. So I think that in essence, the way that we sort of solve for this, I think that the three things that would be key to have systems that can verify what is AI, what isn't AI, what is a bot and who isn't a bot, is to have this verification technology, but have it with certain safeguards, which already exist, for example, under the UK GDPR, but which have been not fully implemented to this day. So I think data minimization is one thing. So I think it should be sort of a conformance requirement. It shouldn't just be a best practice. So for example, for identity or personhood verification, it should be mandate proof of attribute method. So is this online user over 18, as opposed to proof of identity methods like you should just have to give your like date of birth or prove that you're over 18, as opposed to giving them a whole picture of your passport, which contains a lot more data than is needed. So that's like one example. The other thing is sort of consent and disclosure must be at the point of collection. So I think that when this data is being collected by users, from users, that there should be full disclosure, very, very transparent full disclosure about what data is being collected, how is it going to be stored, and what purpose it will be used for. The third point is very obvious, but I think worth mentioning is retention limits tied to verification event and not indefinite storage. So I think that when we're looking to verify, yeah, whatever we're looking to verify, so is this user over 18, for example, the data collection should just answer sort of a single yes or no question. I don't think that the information should be retained for like an indefinite period of time. So like that biometric or identity information shouldn't be retained for an indefinite amount of time. And this is again already prescribed by the UK GDPR. It's just about implementing it. And I think that the highest risk category, to go back to your question of what should be completely off limits, is sort of persistent or portable identity metadata that travels with content or an account beyond a single verification event. So stored ID documents or biometric images required sort of retained after an identity check, or for content, provenance, sort of device, location, creator metadata embedded in creator credentials that persist indefinitely. These should be completely off limits, because not only does it create a massive risk of privacy infringement, particularly if that data provider, if that storage facility was hacked, for example. But also it really threatens the anonymity of certain individuals that really require anonymity to do their job, which are jobs that are very important for the health of democratic society. So whistleblowers, for example, or journalists. And so yeah, so I think that sort of we need to find a more proportional system of verification and the use of verification tools.
Yeah, super interesting. And that also, brings up this idea that I've been thinking about a lot lately, that like our access to AI tools and our access to seeing whether these AI tools have been watermarked, the verification of AI generated content actually sort of shapes the reality that we perceive online. So like if I perceive some social media thing that was completely fake, then it's not watermarked and I can't tell the difference between it and something that's real, then I'm going to believe, or maybe be more predisposed to believe that kind of information. So I want to turn now to Sophie. and I want to bring you in on this question about disinformation as within Europe, predominantly because that's your area of research, as a security and hybrid threat problem. So I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at sort of the geopolitics of disinformation. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and also to the following question. So I mean, the framing of disinformation as a security threat can unlock all sorts of different concepts about, okay, how do we create international coordination to combat the threat? How do we raise the level of urgency at in international fora to legislate policies that, combat dis and misinformation? And it also can move decisions about mis and disinformation regulation into less transparent institutions that are more bureaucratic and less efficient, perhaps. So I want to ask whether democratic legitimacy is itself part of an effective counter-disinformation strategy or policy. Is democratic legitimacy often treated as a constraint to be managed in terms of combating mis and disinformation, or is it a security decision that can be made proactively in order to think about the ways that mis and disinformation may evolve in the future?
Thank you, James. Great question. And to answer specifically on that question, like, is it a constraint, or is it something that should be proactively taken on board from the start, this question of legitimacy? Well, the answer is both. Like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think it should be both. Or I think we should look at it as being both. It's both a constraint and also something that's extremely powerful to make those measures more effective. Because if I'm taking away one thing from this whole conversation and what my wonderful co-panelists have said, is that we have a lot of technical tools available that can rationally help citizens and people in general to see whether something is real or not. And yet we see, as Elisa was saying, that even when you show them this very rational thing of like, actually, this is fake, people still have a very emotional response, right? So you can't fight something that is emotional with something that is rational. It's just not going to work. And when I think about emotional here, and emotion is very linked to trust and identity. And so that's what legitimacy is about. Like, whatever response we're going to be designing to combat misinformation, it has to be tapping into this feeling of trust and that this response is legitimate. So that's exactly what is needed, and that's exactly what the more democratic way of coming together with this response is useful. If you have responses that are very technical and very rational but don't involve the people and aren't democratically designed, it's just not going to work because it doesn't tackle this emotional need of actually trusting what this response is coming from. And so that's exactly what, my research had been showing. So when I think back about what you said, so framing disinformation and misinformation as a security threat makes it much easier for states to do something and to wake up and be like, oh yeah, actually, we really need to put forward a response and fast. And perhaps that was necessary at that moment. And I'm glad that there was a little bit of that push, because we wouldn't have been as prepared to respond to the inflow of misinformation that happened after Russia invaded Ukraine if it wasn't for that. So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, it was needed, I think, a little bit to press the emergency button and say, listen, there's something that's existential that's at risk here, which is the unity of our continent. But on the other hand, I want to be able to take a step back and also say, well, if we really want those measures to work and to work in the long term, we really need to stop treating this as a crisis and to start actually involving people in the design of these responses and making sure that the legitimacy is really built in the eyes of the public. Watermarking, to me, I see it just as like fact checking. It's the same thing. Sure, for somebody who thinks rationally, it's going to make perfect sense, but we all know now that that's not how people think. Human beings are emotional beings, and so it's not because of a watermark that suddenly like imagine this conspiracy theorist that sees the watermark, and I mean they don't believe in the value of this watermark at all, because they will be questioning the whole way that this watermark had been designed and who is putting the watermark with what interest. So that's exactly what we need to be tackling, is building the trust between the public and the response that's being implemented to tackle misinformation.
Perspective, Sophie, and I think your ideas about the validity of watermarks and the authenticity of watermarks are super interesting. Also, in the context of these sort of political actors who are very counterculture and wouldn't respect a watermark even if they saw one, and would continue to embellish their own conspiracy theories. So I want to bring Giovanna back in now, because I want to expand on this idea of democratic trust. And I want to bring you in, Giovanna, because you have this expertise on verification, on thinking about this type of way that we can look at mis and disinformation and determine who's able to see it, who believes it, and what they think about it. So my question for you, Giovanna, is whether anonymity in terms of like the ability to be anonymous online, which is something that we'd like to grant perhaps to people under the age of 18 or certain, political actors or something. So is anonymity online an obstacle to democratic trust or part of fundamental democratic freedom? And how should policy distinguish coordinated inauthentic behavior from legitimate loose use of pseudonyms by, say, people who have valid reasons for using different kinds of identities online, like whistleblowers, dissidents, or people whose safety depends on not being easily identified, such as your expertise shows, people who are under the age of 18 or 16, perhaps in the UK or Europe. So I wonder what you think about whether the proliferation of online anonymity is an obstacle to democratic trust.
I think I'll sort of borrow from what Sophie said, that it can be both. I think that we can't talk in absolutes. So on one hand, anonymity is, yes, an obstacle to trust online. But at the same time, anonymity to an extent, or you can call it by another name, privacy, is a fundamental democratic right, and very important part of a functioning democratic system. So I think it sort of what we need to do is we need to balance between these two priorities, right? So on one hand, we need to assure that we can verify provenance of content and also be able to identify users online so that we can be able to identify bad actors online, right? And then protect our information ecosystems from them. But at the same time, people are entitled to their right to privacy, particularly certain groups over others, I would say. So when we think of minors, people under the age of 16, under the age of 18, that there are sort of higher privacy rates for them. So I think it's that balancing act that's what we need to achieve. As for your second question of effectively how can we achieve that? I don't know that I fully have an answer for that. I think it's very, very complicated, and I think it very much depends on the context in which we're talking about. So I think there has to be enough. I think there has to be a more when it comes to verification tools online. I think there has to be a more harmonized approach um, as to what the standards for verification tools should be for, say, for example, for platform providers. Um, and this should be better regulated. And I think that this is something that Ofcom in particular will have to tackle with the advent of the under 16 ban, for example. But, oh, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
No, no. Anyways. So I think that that's sort of one thing. But at the same time, I think that they are important, and I think there are tools, particularly what are called. Let me just sort of double check the name so that I'm not misinforming people. but basically what are called zero knowledge proofs. I think that that would be the way to go. So zero knowledge proofs let you prove that a statement is true. So for instance, is this content AI generated or is this content human generated without revealing the underlying data about the provenance of that content or the identity of that user, which means that we can get what we need. It's purpose, right? It's sort of purpose limitation. So we can get what we need out of that verification without infringing too much on the privacy rights and the right to anonymity of people. So I think that that's the way to go. The reason why zero knowledge proofs aren't used widely in the industry is because they are more expensive, and they are more complex. Um, but I think that we should at least encourage platforms and providers and sort of online providers to use them more, because I think it's the one that strikes the right balance between privacy rights and the right to anonymity, which is a democratic right, but at the same time, the need to verify and better govern our information ecosystems. So I think that that would be the way to go, but it's going to be an implementation nightmare. In the UK, at least for Ofcom, it would be an implementation nightmare for sure, especially for smaller providers, right? Smaller platforms.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you, Giovanna. Can you all hear me now? Okay, great.
Hmm.
So I'm going to turn to Eliza now, and then I think we may bring in our audience after a moment. But I want to ask Eliza about your work as a social media communicator and about how you think about strategizing content towards your audience based on sort of a community's language and cultural background. So I want to ask whether I want to frame this in sort of a political orientation as well. So I want to ask whether democratic resilience requires institutions, including organizations like your own, including other types of organizations that have large social media strategies and content footprints. Does it require them to be how does it require them to be identity aware in how they communicate? And how do they become identity aware without adopting the same manipulative logic as the campaigns, the mis and disinformation campaigns that they're trying to counter? And I just want to frame this question by saying, like, there's been a lot of talk recently. There was an article in the New York Times just the other day about how, LinkedIn and Instagram and all these social media, big social media platforms are really working hard to combat the deluge of fabricated content on their platforms because it's degrading the experience. So I want to ask this question in the context of that, in terms of both the platform administration, but also the political nature of the question in terms of how do you create content without stooping to the same level as the people who are creating content that is not desirable on these platforms?
Yeah, of course. Love this question, James. And just to clarify, I'm a content strategist. I have a wonderful social media manager who I work with closely, but my expertise extends beyond social. But social is a beast of its own, as you so rightly said. And I also think I saw an article, this must have been the Atlantic, about if in terms of AI slop on the on LinkedIn in particular. If you haven't read it yourself, why should we spend the time reading it? Oh, sorry, written it yourself. Why should we spend the time reading it? And to answer your question about sort of democratic resilience and what that requires to and do democracies and also so does content and or social content need to become identity aware, and can it without adopting manipulative logic? I would say that similar to Giovanna, the distinction is complex, but it's weighted on disclosure, not sophistication here. And I think when I think about my background in social psychology, I think about how everyone views content or views something online through the lens of their social scaffolding, through the frameworks in which they're raised, through their background, their cultural background, their educational background, their political background. How these views are almost like lenses by which they see the world and they interpret and understand meaning from what they see online. And so you had rightfully said at the beginning of this talk that I think about audience before content, I'm thinking of that social scaffolding when I put together a white paper or a piece of media that goes into the world. And that can be accounted for. But I think the line that I'd like to draw is that manipulative logic uses identity mapping to persuade covertly without the audience knowing they're being targeted that way. Whereas identity-aware democratic communication can use the same understanding of a community or an individual's language and cues and social understanding, as long as the source and intent can stay visible. So I'd summarize this by saying, know your audience, but don't disguise yourself as your audience.
Super interesting. Thanks, Eliza, for that in-depth look from the floor from your work. Super interesting. So now I want to make sure we hear from the audience because we have some good questions coming in. And if you want to ask another question, feel free to add to the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but can't promise anything. But we have a first question here from Mohammed Mustafiz, who says, well, they'd like to add a different perspective. They're pursuing a PhD in media, film, and communication at Istanbul University. Their thesis is basically on wartime visual misinformation based on the concurrent Israel-Palestine war. The aspect they want to raise is that propagandists who spread fake content on social media are not just using AI and fabricating the whole content. Rather, they're decontextualizing and recontextualizing the content by spatial, temporal, and situational misattribution. How do we address this issue? And they argue that, and I would also agree with this is more alarming for democracy and a stable cyberspace than a totally rebuilt misinformation content that's directly coming from the model. So maybe, I don't know who wants to take this, but maybe this could be in Sophie's camp if you have any thoughts on this, Sophie, and then we can open it up to the others.
Yeah, sure. Great question indeed, and not an easy one to answer because actually this is not a new problem, right? I mean, misinformation is also not something that's new, and especially during wartime, and wartime propaganda is not something that's new. Um, so it's not a new issue to see that in wartime you see both sides of the conflict decontextualizing something, misattributing something to manipulate the narrative around the conflict. That's not something new. It's true that it's definitely being accentuated and probably exaggerated with AI because now everything just happens faster and easier. But it's not something new. And to very old and complex problems, I always say, there is no easy solution. If somebody's trying to sell you an easy solution to a very complex and old problem, they're probably wrong. So how to address this issue? Well, there is no simple way of addressing this. And I wish there was like a magic solution that I could just come up with, but there isn't. What I can say is that, yeah, of course, we can have in place better regulation that tries to curb that. We can also have all the sorts of tools and techniques that were mentioned during this webinar to reduce the probability that somebody is going to be believing that, or reduce the probability that something like that is going to come up on their feed. But most importantly, I think at the basis of that, and again, I'm sorry that I'm repeating myself, but I'm going back to building this emotional connection and this trust and this legitimacy. So rather than waiting to defend or respond reactively to something that has already happened, it's so much more effective, and the research has proven this again and again and again, to be pre-bunking. And so to be addressing the misinformation that is going to come before it actually comes, because there is this continued influence effect anyway. So when you are subject to misinformation, even when you are corrected afterwards, you still somehow believe in the misinformation because that's the information you were presented first with. And that explains also the whole belief ecosystem that Eliza was just talking about. It's like people look at things through the lenses of like how they were constructed their entire life. So it's not like you can change that with just like a magic trick. You have to build it constantly, patiently, and collectively, building trust, building community, building rapport, building exchange with this audience. So, how to address this issue? Again, I wish there was a simpler solution, but there isn't. I think the answer is to have a very comprehensive communication strategy that is built around um, media and political literacy, where people can understand the media ecosystem in which they are. Second, building community and building that trust and the legitimacy. And yeah, and having the regulation in place that also decreases the probability of having this complicated content from start. But yeah, probably Eliza has something to add on this.
Yeah, I would love to add a little bit, but thank you, Zoe. I think that's a really true. I think it's very challenging to find a concrete solution. But to your point about media literacy, I think there is a few things that one can start doing is where's the source coming from? Who's posting this? Like really kind of putting your investigative journalism hat on and finding when was this posted and in response to what, from who, what is the medium at which they're using, and kind of taking a really step-by-step critical lens to the content itself. And secondly, I do want to bring in inoculation theory here. If we're seeing and we're experiencing the narratives, especially within the what's happening in Israel, Palestine, either sides have very distinct narratives. And if you're only hearing from one side, anything from the other side is going to be seen as false evidence, as false information, as misinformation and disinformation. And again, it pulls us back to why is it considered disinformation? Because the information from one side of the argument versus the other is affirming existing belief system that person holds. And so it's really hard to challenge your own belief systems when they've been ingrained in you from a young age. But I think it starts by questioning what is the intent of that piece of content? What is it trying to achieve? And who is putting out that messaging? And so I think everyone, as to practice safe social media usage, needs to look at every post and think who, what, where. What is what is the intent? So I think that's a little nugget of media literacy people can take into their next social media scroll.
Perhaps we have another question. Perhaps Giovanna could take this one. We have a question from Pierre de Queer who says, thank you to the speakers. These were very interesting presentations. My question is related to recent news that AI agents had escaped their locked sandboxes to go hack a different company's resources. Just some time ago, the perspective of AI agents becoming entirely autonomous would have seemed something to be in the sole realm of science fiction, yet it seems to be happening now. So I'm wondering, as it seems inevitable that we shall soon see in the near future AI fully autonomous agents disseminating misinformation outside of human initiative or supervision, do you have any thoughts on how this kind of situation should be approached?
Wow, that's an existential threat question, which would be quite hard to answer. Well, I think with sort of the Anthropic one specifically, I think it's true. Yes, we're seeing more and more agentic AI foraying into our information ecosystems to an extent unprompted by humans, and it feels a little bit science fiction-y, even sort of like a dystopian Orwellian reality. But it is true that we could get soon to a stage where we have these sort of free AI powered AI agents running havoc in our information ecosystems and in other ecosystems. I think, James, you've done quite a bit of research, I think, on financial disinformation, and we only know the havoc that could impose in our societies. There is no simple answer to how to fix this, unfortunately. To an extent, I think of, okay, what could AI, what could government do, right? As a policy professional, I think, okay, what could government do to respond to this? What are the safeguards that we could impose on AI models that are being developed? And I think that is the key place that we could we could try, which is basically, I think, what Sophie had mentioned, which instead of waiting for something to happen and acting reactively, how can we solve sort of the key issue, which would be not having models that can do this? Because what is the purpose that these models serve? It's just technological development for the sake of technological development. Technology should take a humanist approach to technology to serve humanity. But it's not, depending on where you are, definitely in the US, that's not a politically it's a very politically contentious point of we should regulate new AI models and maybe curb development, because then there's the whole discussion with like, oh, well, we're going to lose the AI race against China. And if we don't create these models, China will, and it will be in the control, in the hands of an authoritarian state, and so on and so forth. So to me, I think that we should have better regulation and better governance standards for new emerging AI models. They should pass basic safety checks so that they can't just go rogue, as we have seen in this latest case. But do I feel like this is going to be politically feasible in this tech race that we exist in? No, like I don't think it's going to happen, particularly not within the ecosystem of the US and with our current, I'm not American, but with the current administration. So it's like there's what we should do and what will most likely happen. So I think it's quite a tricky one. But yes, in essence, we should have better regulation. It should be sort of like much like we have for like a new drug that comes into a new sort of pharmaceutical drug that comes into market has to pass XYZ safeguards approved by the FDA. We should have an equivalent regulatory body for AI models and other emerging technologies, to make sure that they meet basic market agreed standards so that everyone is playing fair as well, right? So that it's not just going to be impacting one in AI developer, but it's going to be impacting all of them. So it's less of so it's sort of won't impact competition and they're more likely to buy into it. But then I think that we should have, because it's obviously not just concentrated in the US, and we have particularly Chinese companies also developing these really frontier AI models. I think there has to be at an international level more dialogue. I think it's in the interest of both of these countries and of humanity at large for there to be more dialogue at the senior leadership level, which could come to happen. I think Trump is going to China fairly soon, or going to meet Xi Jinping fairly soon to potentially discuss this. But yes, a better, maybe an international treaty, which obviously is going to be very hard to actually implement, but something around those lines, an internationally agreed, legally binding framework of basic safeguards for AI models that companies that both US developers as well as Chinese developers would have to stick by. So those are sort of at the national and the international level what I feel we could do going forward.
Great. So I'm going to make sure I'm audible now. I think I'm audible.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah, so I just want to say thank you for that super interesting interjection, Giovanna. I believe you have to leave a few minutes early, so I wanted to say thank you for joining us today before you drop out. So we make sure that we thank you for your contribution to the panel, which was super interesting and incredibly valuable. So thanks, Giovanna. Whenever
Yeah.
you need to drop out,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, yeah, and I just thank CCOD and James for organizing this, and also Sophie and Eliza. Very, very like interesting points. I'm sad that I can't stay for our debrief after the webinar. Unfortunately, my lunch break is over and I must go back to work. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the audience and for the very interesting questions. I appreciate it. So I will be dropping out in a couple of minutes, but thank you so much, all of you.
Great. Okay, so we have a few more questions. We have a question that I'd like to pose to Sophie from Michelle Klein, and she asks, each of the speakers referred to the need for AI regulation. So actually, this dovetails right off of what Giovanna was just discussing. In your experience, what level, national, global, industry level, etc., is AI regulation likely to be most effective? The EU seems to be very much in the lead on this, but as the majority of major AI companies are US and Chinese, how effective is regulation likely to be when both of these governments currently seem unlikely to support meaningful regulation? What kinds of strategies do you think would be most effective?
Yeah, interesting question. Few things. First of all, at what level? That's the first part of this question. To me, it seems very obvious, and I think that was mentioned before, that we need some kind of alignment. We need some kind of common standards. Imagine if every state has a different set of regulation on how to deal with AI. I think everybody can imagine how much of a nightmare that would be, which is why existing regulation have been mostly developed at the EU level. So I can think of the AI Act. And of course, that's a very big chunk of legislation. It came with its own set of challenges. It took a long time, lots of negotiation, currently being rolled out. So when it comes to Europe, that's already like that question has already been answered. It is regulated at the EU level, and I think that that's the right way of doing it. To do it at a supranational level, so that there is this element of common standard and level playing field. Because every time that you have to deal with different sets of regulation, you also put a little bit of challenges for technology to develop for good or for bad. But so we shouldn't curb too much innovation either and create too much barriers for innovation to flourish, because there is also a big question of strategic advantage being held by the international actors who are capable of developing that technology faster and better than the others. And here in this AI race, I don't think that Europe is leading. I think everybody knows Europe is not leading. So we are leading in terms of very good regulation, but we're a little bit losing this race when it comes to developing the technology itself, which has very important long-term consequences. So it's important to find the right balance between those two things of having regulation that protects us and our human rights and our autonomy and our sovereignty, yes, but also that doesn't create too much challenge for innovation to flourish and to make sure that we actually have any weight at all on the global stage, because otherwise without one the other doesn't really make any sense at all. So it's important, I think, to look at those two things together. Um, and let me read the rest of that question. Then, yes, most of the companies are in the US and China. That doesn't really change anything. If they operate in Europe, they have to respect the rules that Europe has set for European citizens. So, regardless of where the companies are based, they still have to respect EU regulations. But what I think Michele or Michelle was asking with this question is like, how do we ensure that these big companies that become very powerful actually respect the regulation that we are setting for our European market? And well, that's exactly what I was hinting at with the first part of my answer, that we have to make sure that we're still relevant on the global stage if we want our rules to be respected. So of course the European market is huge and massively important for all those companies. But yeah, we have to make sure that Europe remains relevant on the global stage if we want our regulation to still matter and be respected. And more broadly, so like, what do you think could be most effective? So I think with this question, it's kind of like the question of is regulation the answer to this? And again, big problem, no simple solution, right? So regulation is going to be part of the answer. It's not going to be the answer. And I don't think that you can solve everything with regulation. Here as well, I think there is a huge need for rules regarding AI to be democratically designed and designed in a way that is collectively done with citizens and the population. There's this big question at the moment of how we can design public interest technology, and there's very different understanding of what public interest actually means or public values. And so I think involving citizens and the broader population in that discussion and having democratic AI being built is part of that answer that goes way beyond regulation, but more so in the co-designing exercise of the technology. And that I think is so much more effective in the long term when you involve people from the get-go into designing the rules that are going to be applying rather than just saying, oh, we have decided this for you and here how it goes. I always think of the analogy of a child, and you have to teach the child to eat their meal. Well, actually, if you ask them to participate in making the meal, they're so much more likely to eat it. Well, it's the same thing. It's the same principle that applies here. Like if you involve people into making the rules, they're so much more likely to respect it. And this is valid for the population, and this is also valid for the companies. So I think it's hugely important to involve the various stakeholders now into deciding exactly what we mean by this public interest AI and public value-oriented technology.
Democratic AI, co-design, interpretable AI, these are all great points to end on, I think. My sincere thanks to Sophie Verita, Eliza Solomon, and Giovanna de Custodio for an unusually rich discussion, from democratic legitimacy and counter-disinformation policy to the way political messages become shared common knowledge, to the accountability of AI systems that are increasingly used to govern public life. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you for contributing your questions and for joining us at this discussion today. If there's one thread to carry forward from this discussion, is that trust cannot be engineered by technology alone. Democracies need credible information, but they also need visible reasons for citizens to trust the institutions, procedures, and people deciding how that information is governed. That means transparency without naivety, accountability without paralysis, and resilience that treats the public as participants rather than simply as targets for correction. So to conclude, this has been the second session of the third section, actually, of the CCOD webinar series. An edited recording, highlights, and a written summary will be shared through CCOD's media channels, and details of future events will be posted on the CCOD's media as well. If this conversation connects with your own research, policy, or professional work, we'd be very glad to hear from you. Until next time, thank you very much, Eliza, Sophie, and Giovanna, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.